Okay, welcome back everybody to the third panel of this day. I'm Sabine Muscat, one of the co-organizers of this conference. I work for the Heinrich Böll Foundation here in Washington, D.C. And for those of you, well, I hope you all are able to stay awake, and I hope the coffee was strong enough that we served here. And thanks for sticking around. And for those of you who may not have been here all day, in the morning we heard a lot about how data is governed domestically to facilitate development and what the development community can do to help build good governance. So our job is to bring you the global perspective, and that's why we're a very international panel. Together we span 4 continents, and I was going to introduce my panelists in the order of how far they've had to travel to get here. So I would start with Nyabola. She is a writer and political analyst, and she's based in Nairobi, so she definitely had the longest trip. Thank you for coming. And her focus is on the impact of digital technologies on Kenya's society and democracy. And by the way, she's written a whole book about that, Digital Democracy, Analog Politics. And for anyone who's interested, she did bring some copies. I can highly recommend it. So it's a great book. And we have Sreekanth Mukku. He is from India, but now works in Germany at Konnektiv, Kollektiv in Berlin. And they are a consulting agency working with partners in developing countries and development organizations on the use and governance of data-driven technologies. And they've also been consulting the Heinrich Böll Foundation on their digital strategy and approach. So yes, welcome. And some of you have already met Teresa, Scassa. She is the chair in information law and policy at the University of Ottawa, and she's a fellow with CG's International Law Program. She also advises the Canadian government on issues of data governance, from AI to statistics and to smart cities, as most of you will know by now. Yeah. And then we have Burcu, who just introduced herself at the end of the second panel already. And but let me introduce her properly. She is a lawyer like Teresa and has a background in intellectual property law. She directs the digital rights program at the consumer rights organization Public Citizen in DC. And her focus is on privacy, digital trade, and also access to medicines. And Burcu is originally from Turkey, just to stress that we're very global. So since I work for the Heinrich Böll Foundation and we consider ourselves part of the German and also the global green movement, we had the chairman of the German Green Party who visited DC last week, and it just is something that just reminded me, the discussions today reminded me of something he said in a speech last week, that markets are not jungles but gardens. And we heard Claire had this term of a walled-off garden in her chart, and well, I mean, we'll talk about that too, whether we have to wall off our gardens. But definitely, if we want the digital economy to facilitate inclusive development, and if we want to bridge the gap between and within countries, we have to do some gardening. I think we all agree on that. There's also been a lot of, we were actually quite impressed at the feedback and the response we got for this conference, and people telling us, oh, it's such a timely debate, and it's time that people talk about these issues. But as early as 2015, there was a report for the World Economic Forum in Davos that actually touched upon all these issues and identified the 2 major obstacles to data-driven development as the data deficit and the trust deficit. So the inequalities in access to data, which we've talked about a lot today, and the lack of governance systems to ensure the proper and ethical use of those data. So then, at the last panel, how do we tackle these obstacles? Let's talk about that. And let's also talk about the need for global rules versus some things that may have to be decided nationally within countries. That's a tricky balance, and these are the questions we'll try to answer on this panel. And I wanted to start with you, Teresa, from a data governance perspective in general. Have we come any closer to bridging these gaps over the past 5 years? It's really 5 years ago that they wrote this report, and has this divide, has it actually narrowed or even widened? Like, how would you assess where we're at right now?
Yeah, lawyers like to give waffly answers like it depends. So I'll say yes and no. In terms of bridging the gap, and the gap was identified not just in terms of the kinds of data that were being collected by governments, so that there was a data gap in terms of what was actually being collected, and a data gap in terms of what could be accessed and used. And I think that on the one hand, there has been progress made. I mean, if you look at open data, for example, in the open data movement, there have been steps taken. There have been, new portals created, new data sets made available, attempts to make data more open, to find uses for open data. And so it would be wrong to say there hasn't been any movement with respect to open data. And there also have been initiatives to find, and we've heard about some of them over the course of the day, to find ways to partner with the private sector, for example, to get access to mobile communications data or other data that can be useful, and to find ways of sharing that data and making use of that data. So there have been steps taken, there's progress made. We've, over the course of today also, we've heard lots of examples of efforts to collect, to access, to use data, to find novel uses. And so, again, that work also is going on. And so that's the yes part of the progress in terms of the gap. The no part is that it's one of those things where it's almost like that mirage in the desert that you keep moving towards, right? And it keeps getting further and further away, because at the same time, since 2015, we've seen this huge explosion in demand for data, and the explosion of artificial intelligence, machine learning, all of these technologies that are incredibly data thirsty. And so that has the effect of further kind of expanding the data gap, because all of a sudden you need more data. And so maybe we're making some progress in getting access to some data, and in finding ways to collect new forms of data, to develop better statistical data. But at the same time, there's been this enormous expansion of the hunger, thirst, need for data that is, I think, just exacerbating the data gap. So that's my waffly lawyer answer.
All right. Well, the hunger. Oops. Is this working? Yes. So you were talking about the increasing hunger for data, and then I'm looking at Nanjala here, who is from Kenya, and who has, although carefully, used the term digital colonialism, even though not everybody might be comfortable with that term. It is also definitely, there's a big difference, and we're not referring to a system of physical oppression here. But at the same time, Kenya and many countries in the global south are probably in the middle of some sort of finding themselves in the middle of a big power competition also, with like US big tech companies, Chinese big tech companies, everybody's planting their flags there. What has that meant for Kenya? How do you see that manifest itself?
Microphone is on, yes? Okay. I'm very comfortable using the word colonialism to describe this power struggle, because I think that, first of all, we have to think about what colonialism was, and the flattening out of the citizen in the colonial state, the flattening out of the identity of the human being in the colonial state, turning them into production points, into units of production. So you're not a human being with a family, with a history, with part of a society, but you are a point of labor. You're a point of production. Your value to the society, to the polity, is only measured relative to your productive capacity. And so, for example, in Kenya, in fact, colonization in Kenya is inseparable from the idea of data, of individual data. I'm not going to say citizen, because of course colonial subjects were not citizens. I've spent a lot of time in the last couple of months reading through the Hansard, the parliamentary records of Kenya, going all the way back to 1915. Kenya got independence in 1963. And what you see with the colonial government was a collection of data from especially African males over the age of 16 was a core part of forced labor, was a core part of reorganizing traditional societies, was a core part of turning Kenya into an export part of the British Empire. And there's a lot of for me, what that is there's a power dynamic between three forces: the citizen, or the individual, or the subject, the data subject, the corporations, the entities that are collecting that data, and the states, the governance element of this all. In the pre-independence era, those 3 points would be the subject. It would be the British East Asia Company. It would be the British East Africa Company. It would be the corporate entity that was trying to monetize the human element of this. And then you would have the colonial administration. Now, what you want is a situation whereby power is vested in the individual. Because we generate data just by virtue of our existence. We create information just by virtue of existence. We need to have the right, I think, as individuals, to determine how that data is used. I think to me that's like the basic principle that is being questionably applied in the way we think about the contemporary era. And that's why I'm very comfortable with the colonialism label, because I see my position as a Kenyan citizen, for example, in which I generate data, biometric data. I generate, just by going through immigration, just by having an ID card, just by, getting a frequent shopper card at the supermarket. And I generate all of this data. And my government, until November of last year, had the capacity to turn that into an economic, they could sell that information to anybody without having to ask me about it. The companies could do that, could trade with my identity, my existence, without having to ask me to do that. And so my whole argument about digital colonialism is really an analysis of power. How does the digital alter the power dynamic between the citizen and their state, between the citizen and the corporations that are operating in their geographical territory? Does the way in which we think about the digital make us more powerful as human beings or less powerful? Does it give us more agency in our private and public lives or less agency? And I think where we are right now is we've let corporations get away with so much for so long that citizens in the developing world, in countries where we don't have, like I, as a Kenyan citizen, how can I sue, Facebook? How can I sue Twitter? And yet, in Ethiopia, someone puts up a post on Facebook, an incendiary post, and 68 people die. Where do I have the agency? And those are the kind of power dynamics, the power analysis that makes me very comfortable with the colonialism label, because that's really what it was. We stopped being people and start being units of production.
In some ways, you're using the term a bit like Nick Holdry in his book, I would assume, does, in terms of that we're all being colonized, that sense, but maybe as we heard in previous panels, the poor could be more vulnerable to this. Sreekanth, you're from India, and India has been a focal point of debates over data sovereignty that now everyone is talking about these days. The Europeans are talking about, everyone's talking about data sovereignty principles. And your organization was actually part of the discussions over a digital justice manifesto that was published by the JustNet Coalition at the Internet Governance Forum in Berlin. And some of the points in that manifesto pertain to data sovereignty. Data should be processed close to the point of origin. Cross-border data flows must be decided nationally. Does this leave room for global data governance, or could you even describe where the debate is at in India right now? Because you also hinted that there's been a lot of changes lately.
Yeah, from India's perspective, data governance has always been a kind of a complex thing. So India's privacy law, it was the way it was envisioned was very different from today how it was passed in the parliament. So the early stages of the bill was more progressive, where you had laws to protect the data, but at the same time to give more room for data sovereignty. But today the law has changed, and the data localization clause has been removed, and in this place of data localization you have a kind of only sensitive data has to be processed in India. The other data can be, can flow outside India. So now it leaves room for kind of a cross-border data flow, and I think the most of the countries also would do that, and eventually the global governance may not have the rules to govern everything, because it is not possible practically, because we live in a nation state framework, so obviously it is not possible, but there is always room for making a framework where these rules are harmonized and they can come together. Like there are different examples what we have seen already, like banking regulations, like climate action, how the negotiations happen, and then how the rules frameworks are made so that countries can adapt and sign declarations. So that's how I see this is all going forward, but not at the global level. There is a governance where the rules are made and then all are implemented at a national level. So that's my take.
But India's position has weakened a lot on the data requirement, and that's okay. But even for other countries, Burcu, would they even be in a position to have this debate over data sovereignty if they don't have a large market and if they don't have as much leverage as India and arguably even Kenya would have? So.
I mean, that's a very interesting question, but I just want to follow up on what others said. Like, Teresa said that there is a demand for the data. That's the reality of today's business model, right? Like, the business model is based on collection of data. All the apps we use, all the online services we benefit, like everything is based on collection of data. So that's the business model. And then we have people in the global south. They are colonialized, but like us, like US consumers, are not in better position because we are colonialized here too. Like even the Europeans, they think that they have the GDPR, they have the protections. My organization, as I mentioned previously, does lots of testing. We test the apps, we test the services. And all findings indicate that even in Europe, the European consumers, they are not protected that much. I mean, they are not protected as they believe to be. Because what happens is, the business model collects the data. Like all the companies, apps, startups, big tech companies, they collect the data and they share the data. Most of the time, our data is shared or sold. We don't even with the companies, we have no idea of how it is shared or used. So that's the reality. And as consumers, we are all colonized by data. So that's the reality of. And when you look at the global discussions, you see that countries like Europe, coming to global, especially global trade discussions, with a standpoint that privacy is important for us, and it's a trade issue, So you need to respect the privacy rules of Europe. But the other countries, they're not in that position because they don't have the rules. They don't. I mean, how can you ask a trade negotiator? And that's the challenge that I've been facing. We asked trade negotiators, because there are all these discussions happening at the WTO in other FTAs about the free flow of data, which means that data should flow freely, and data has been flowing freely for such a long time. There are certain exceptions like China. But when there's a rule that the data should flow freely, any regulation you introduce related to privacy and other data-related issue becomes a non-tariff barrier. So we go to trade negotiators, ask them to protect privacy, and when I say privacy, I use that as an umbrella term because, I hear it a lot from people. It's privacy is a very European issue. It's the European colonialism. But privacy means transparency. Privacy means accountability. Privacy means human rights. Privacy means competition. It's an umbrella term, and we put all these concepts under privacy. Anyway, when you ask the trade negotiators, like, protect privacy, protect human rights, they are like, we don't have the rules. How can we protect something we don't have in our country? So, just to answer your question, and I know this doesn't want me to be brief.
No, I'm sorry.
But just to answer your question, yeah, the countries they don't have the governance regimes, they don't have the privacy protections, they don't have the competition rules. So when they go to the global forums, they don't know what to claim or what to protect. I mean, this is valid for the U.S. negotiators or U.S. delegates, because we've been trying really hard to get a federal privacy protection in this country, and it's not going anywhere. So it's we are not in a different position than you. Actually, in Kenya, you're in a better position because you have rights and protections because of your newly introduced privacy law. In the U.S., now Californians got that, and with certain services and apps, we benefit from the Californian protections, but most of us, we have no rights and protections, and that's the reality. This is the consumer reality.
Wow, now I don't even know where to go from here because I could take it in so many different directions now. But I think one interesting point that came out of your statement is essentially you're saying, well, we're talking about the WTO, about data governance rules and cross-border data flows before countries have national rules. So, Teresa, what do you think? Can this happen in parallel, that countries design data governance and at the same time there's a global debate happening? And what's the right order in dealing with these questions?
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting question. What I see in the Canadian experience, and what scares me a little bit, is beginning to deal with data issues, and not just data protection or privacy, but a range of different data issues in trade agreements before we've even figured out who we are within this kind of data environment. Because we're a country, our population is under 40 million, so we're not a big player in that sense. Although, Canada is a developed nation, but we have a relatively small population. We're sitting between the EU and the United States when it comes to data protection, and pulled in a couple of different directions by our relationships with those countries. It's an uncomfortable position to be in, and we're used to it. And we may not have a lot of people to be generators of personal data, but we also have some fairly unique types of other data that might be a valuable resource. And so there we are, trying to figure this out, trying to figure out how to protect our citizens and protect human rights, trying to figure out what we want to do around data, what localization or sovereignty might look like in Canada. And at the same time, there's, got to negotiate these bilateral and multilateral trade agreements in which we are essentially being pushed to make certain commitments with respect to data. Those commitments get made, and then all of a sudden you realize that some of your domestic policy options have just been closed off. And so you're still trying to figure out how to play in this environment, and the doors are closing all around you because you really, you need to enter into these trade agreements. So whether it's the USMCA, which is your name for it, you can just tell how the relationship has gone off, because in Canada it's called the CUSMA. It used to be the NAFTA, which was the same name for everybody, but now, anyway, it doesn't. But there's that. There's the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. I mean, these are just happening, and I think that this is one of the challenges, that the options and choices get narrowed by powerful countries with very particular data agendas pushing for concessions in trade agreements, getting those concessions in trade agreements, and leaving smaller countries with different economic realities finding their choices continually being limited. So I think this is a concern. And so in some ways, better to do the data governance first, so that when you're at the trade table, you say, can't do that because we have these laws, and so we have to find some other solution, as opposed to, I guess we just won't have laws.
Yeah, Burcu also mentioned Kenya has now a data protection law and introduced it after it started some massive data collection programs, actually, but it is now introduced. And so who are you more worried about in general? Are you more worried about foreign powers dictating how data is being used in Kenya, or are you more worried about your own government in some ways? Do you have hope that this is now closer to a resolution and that this will actually help both growth and democracy in Kenya?
So there are 54 countries in Africa. As of last year, only 2 had comprehensive data protection laws. That was Kenya and South Africa. The 3 biggest countries that are the 3 fintech leading countries in Africa are Kenya, South Africa, and Nigeria. So South Africa, Kenya, and then Nigeria in that order. And so you look at that landscape and you think, well, this should be fairly straightforward, right? For the people who have the biggest markets should have the most interest in creating some kind of order. Kenya's data protection law was stuck in Parliament from 2011. And the reason why it was stuck in Parliament from 2011 was because of the political situation. And when you look at how in fact, in the end, because we have a bicameral legislature, we have a Senate and a National Assembly, there were 2 data protection laws working their way through the government. And the reason why was because one was from the government and one was from the opposition, and there was like a whole thing. And so when you look at that and you look at the landscape and you look at the extent to which politics has influenced the data protection conversation, as a citizen, I am equally afraid of my government as I am of foreign corporations. Because what you're seeing is a government that is willing to subjugate political advantage to doing the right thing by its own citizens. And the reason why we got a data protection law in the end, in fact, those of us who have been working in the digital rights space were very sort of taken aback by how quickly it happened, because it had been dragging out for so long. And part of the surprise was that, as you said, in the beginning of 2018, the government began this massive data collection exercise in the name of a new identity system called the Huduma number. And their whole argument was that they were building a single source of truth ID system that would have biometrics and DNA information and GPS coordinates and all of this information, and there was no data protection law. And of course, they got sued, and even after the law comes after the case had got into deliberation. So everybody's submissions were over, and then they were like, oh my gosh, we're going to lose this case. We better pass a law very quickly. And so I think as a citizen of a country that should be in a better place in terms of thinking about the ramifications of collecting information at this scale and monetizing it at that dramatic scale, and yet seeing that the politics can still displace that priority so completely. I'm as afraid of, Amazon Web Services as I am of the government of Kenya, because ultimately, the first thing that the day that the data protection law was passed, Amazon announces that it's opening a data processing cloud center in Nairobi. So there's a level at which if I keep going back to that triangle, I think, was the reason why this law passed because the state wanted to protect my rights as a citizen, or was it another level of cohabitation between the corporation and the state? And where does that leave me then as a citizen?
That is interesting that the company decided to go into Kenya after it had passed a data protection law, which is actually an interesting
Well, there's a long story we
have legal.
I think for me, I keep going back to one of my favorite movies of the last 5 years is Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, the cartoon. It's amazing. But there's a line in that movie that gets repeated multiple times, which is, watch the hands, not the mouth. That means pay attention to what people are doing and not what they're saying. The Kenyan government talks a really good talk about data and privacy and being a digital government and being a digital economy. But the reality of the political situation throws up a much more contradictory picture. And we end up going into these forums and these negotiations whereby what we're getting is the lobbying, the corporations that have lobbying power have much more influence in policy making. I mean, I've looked at that data protection law. It's not awful. It's not terrible. Is it the best law that we could have gotten? Is it the fairest law that we could have gotten? Are the principles as well set out as they could have been? No. There's a lot of room for mischief, let's put it that way, just to save time. There's a lot of room for mischief.
So Susan had warned me to make sure we're also talking about solutions on this panel, not instead of, and don't just complain. So what would be a way, maybe either one of you wants to take that question, how can a low-income country be a participant on an equal level in the global digital economy without having to sacrifice citizens' rights or sovereignty? What is a way to do this? And is there an example of a country that is doing this well and that is playing a good game?
That's a good question.
Tough question. Very tough question.
I don't know any.
Yeah, even I don't know any country who's doing it. But I think they can maybe host of other things from developed countries. They can, components which can be contextualized in their own context. They can bring it to their local context and then implement it. That's the only way I could see it. Because maybe GDPR from Europe, you bring it to your own context and then make it, more, because the low-income countries wouldn't have this kind of resources to implement it and then to make this as an effective law which can be enforced, and then every small business has to go through this, and then every citizen has to know what actually it entails, and then whether his rights on digital spaces, how it is protected. So this is all a big task for a developing country or a low-income country. Even in India, for that matter, it's not easy to. They brought the law, but still they don't have data protection agency and the data protection officer. There's no awareness programs. There's nothing actually, virtually at this point in time. So. The only way is the cooperation, developed and developing countries cooperation, and then creating platforms. The learnings can be from here to there, it can flow, but that's the only way I could see, especially from a regulatory perspective. Otherwise, developing countries on their own, I don't think so they can stand.
And of course, regional cooperation. I think that for a long time, the African Union has been trying to develop a strategy, like a digital strategy. It's very difficult because you really have a whole spectrum of capacity, like domestic capacity. You're talking about, 54 countries ranging from South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya to the Central African Republic and Chad, and, countries with a population of 70,000 people, Seychelles and whatever, and trying to find a way to harmonize the interests. The sector that has been driving the digital conversation in Africa for a long time has been fintech, has been financial services. And within all of the African countries, the fintech interests are different. Countries like Mauritius have always been sort of offshore. A lot of money gets processed offshore in Mauritius. A lot of African money goes through Mauritius for offshore processing. And so their interest in having data localization is very different from a country like South Africa, which is very, very big on everything that is generated in South Africa must be processed in South Africa. But the regional cooperation offers some kind of a way forward. And on the GDPR, I think for us in Kenya, what ended up happening was because a lot of Kenyan companies have their servers in Europe, the GDPR we ended up like second-hand protection through that, because you had the companies had to have their information processed by European standards. So, trying to find a way of making that a more formal arrangement, I think regional cooperation offers a starting point to do that.
Yeah, I think a very similar thing happened ASEAN region, where the most of the companies in Indonesia or Thailand, they interact with Singapore, and Singapore brought the law. So they have tried to copy or emulate Singapore, or because they had to already comply with the standards what Singapore has implemented. So that's, I think, the regional cooperation also is a way forward.
Regional cooperation. Before I open this for everybody, I would like to get back one more time to the global rules, from national to regional to global. I think we're on a good way here. Once we have that, and maybe that's to Burcu and Teresa, then the question, where is the place? Claire said if there's any job for the UN, it's this. Where is the right place to tackle this at the global level? Where should data be governed, and what are the issues that have to be dealt with at the global level, that can't be dealt with at the national or regional level? Do you have?
Yeah, I mean, my response will be very American. But although I'm not American, I will respond this question very American, and the solution is here, because at the end of the day, data flows to the US. Until we get the rules here, none of our data is safe. So we need to get the rules here in DC, because when you look at the global data flows, there is only one, maybe two, like with China now, like destinations where data flows. So I will say we need to get the rules here in the US, and we need to get it right, because there have been like proposals, like bills like introduced, and most of those bills, they don't challenge the system. They avoid challenging the system. They give away some rights to consumers without like challenging the system, which is based on data collection, unlimited data collection and processing. So we need to challenge the system, change the business model here, get the right privacy protections. Not only the privacy, as I said, it's competition, antitrust, also transparency, accountability, and enforcement, because that's the biggest problem in Europe. Like we published a report, and the report results proved us that, like, although there is GDPR in Europe, although the European data is not protected well, because it flows to here, and it's like, the enforcement is very important, but it starts here, and I hate to say that, but like we can't get the global rules right without figuring it out here, because here is the destination for data. California is a good start. It is changing the discussion, because until California entered into force, like we were talking about, like, very basic concepts. At least now, like, we know that, like, we established the foundation. Like, for instance, like before California entered into force, we did a study about Amazon. I asked for my data from Amazon. And the Amazon response was like, you don't have that right. We can't share your data with you. And then after California entered into force, California bill, I asked it again, and I got my data. What I got is like, it's not very comprehensive. It's not necessarily the data I was expecting to receive, but I got my data. So the right of access is established. There is certain kind of transparency. We need to establish this with these companies so that we can have the global discussions.
Teresa, what would you say to that? Do we have to wait for the US to sort it out, or are there ways and forums which institution should talk about things for global?
I think there's a lot of truth to what Burcu is saying, that the inaction in the United States is a huge barrier to finding global solutions. One thing I'd add, and I don't know if this is just academic daydreaming or whatever, but I think that there's also perhaps a problem with the concept of privacy as it has evolved. And you were speaking about how we have to think of it more broadly in terms of competition law and transparency and these other things. And I think that's part of it. we have allowed privacy to be reduced to data protection, and data protection to be turned into this balance with the need of corporations to have data in order to participate in the economy. And it's shifted from being a human right to just this consideration in that balance. And so if you want economic development, you're going to strike the balance in a particular way. And so I think that we also may need to rehabilitate privacy in this global discourse and put much more emphasis on those other human rights dimensions or other human rights that are tied up in data governance, which include transparency and accountability, but also include the right to be free from discrimination and equality rights and development rights. I mean, this is it's not just about, because the other thing with privacy is it gets reduced to individuals and then you get nobody really cares about privacy anymore.
Yeah.
And everybody wants cheaper or free Facebook. Yeah. So it's all good. So I think we have to move away from that into a much more robust sense of what it is that's on the table. It's not just this very individualistic view of privacy as data protection as a trade-off, but it's fundamental human rights and how we're going to live in the world, in this datafied world.
I need just say one thing about the UN and data. In the chronology of large sort of biometric individual data collection systems, processes, whatever. In Kenya, it begins the 1915 Native Registration Ordinance. It goes to 1948, the Registration of Persons Act. That's amended. Fast forward to the 2000s, before we even had this proposal of digital data collection on citizens, the UN was collecting information from refugees, and the UN has this massive biometric system, but it's almost worse than the way in which the Huduma number was implemented in Kenya, because it is actually an effective barrier to services. So if you are not registered, if they don't have the biometrics, if you're not, you will not get food, you will not get, services, and so. Can the UN, before it becomes, not before, or alongside becoming this forum for this conversation, get its own practices right? Because what ended up happening is when the Kenyan government announced the Huduma number, this is the single source of truth number, a lot of refugees looked at this and said, I'm being registered again, another barrier to getting services, and people went back. South Sudanese refugees literally looked at the situation and said, it's better for me to go back to a war zone than to be subjected to these constant processes of having my information collected and having services and having basic things denied to me by these organizations that I don't understand. And these are some of the existential questions that we think about away from, DC and away from, and I 100% agree. I think that the US conversation on this digital world is so inward-looking that it hides the fact that the choices made here have impacts all the way on the other side of the world, and not for me the impact is more philosophical and etc. But for some people it really is a life or death thing. The influence that some of these conversations have had where they've not seen the human impact have become life or death things for the companies that are, the UN is being told by a consulting firm, this is how you need to build your ID system, and because Amazon wants it to be done that way, people die.
Wow, I would imagine that there are some people in this room who would like to comment on this. That's why I would.
Very briefly.
But actually, I would like to open the floor very briefly. Okay,
very briefly, because this. I mean, we come back to the issue that I raised in previous, at the previous session, because all these high-tech solutions that the development agencies propose or the donors. Do we really need them? What are we trying to solve with the biometric ID? What is the solution we are looking for? And can we do it in a simple way?
Yep. Agree.
That's my question.
Yeah.
To the floor.
Question to the floor. Okay, we'll follow the model of the previous two panels, and we'll get 2 or 3 questions at a time, and you raised your hand first, and who else was there?
There's one question there.
One question there, and another one there, and I see two more hands, but we'll take three first, and then we'll move on. Yes, please.
Thanks for this panel and also for the whole conference. I think...
And please identify yourself.
My name is Li Yang. I think this conference is very important and very interesting, and the title is very good. The basic is about the data and related to the development. But what I want to say is we must focus on the basic, whether that's data or whether that's legislation or whether that's government practice or whatever. And I think you are right, and you are right. U.S. is very important. I don't know whether way back, century before, they influenced all other colony, or whether it is now, whether there's a police brutality. Basic is really in America, because America had to be leaders. So if they don't do it right, if they give you a mass incarceration, but they never mention the human rights violation in America. So, and so if we think about the empirical data, if they don't protect people with everything, misconduct or legislation, misuse or whatever, there's no protection of people or no protection of your productivity.
Thank you very much.
We must do this.
Do you have a question to
My question is, can we really do the basic, improve the U.S. government legislation and law enforcement?
Okay.
So we can have a productivity and everything going up higher, and happiness, protection of people, family, their business, everything possible.
Okay, thank you. We'll get two more questions, and then we'll do the next round. I think, yes, please.
I have a question to bring one of the ideas from the earlier panel into this one.
And could you introduce yourself one more time, because we have new faces in the audience. So thanks.
I'm Jenna Slotin from the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. I'm curious whether the people on the panel, particularly Nanjala, Sreekanth, have seen examples where civil society, citizens groups, community groups have started to organize around these challenges and to advocate vis-a-vis government authorities and even business. Because in earlier today we talked a lot about the need and the role of civil society, but we haven't heard a lot of examples and solutions. And particularly, I'd love to hear from different regions of the world if you can offer some.
Thank you. And I think we had, who was first?
Gentleman here, who was first?
Okay, then please, yeah.
Hey, my name is Garrett Hasso, and I work for the Center for Financial Inclusion at Axion. To your point about fintech sort of being the first wave of that data revolution, so to speak, or lack thereof, in Africa, one of the things that we're struggling with is how do we catalyze financial services to better serve the 3 billion people who are underbanked around the world, while at the same time balancing their privacy rights. So my question is, from your backgrounds, what do you see as like the path forward for that?
All right. Who would like to take either of these questions? I think the question about civil society and what can the positive results be is probably for the two of you.
Actually, yes, because we have a great example from yesterday. So the civil society led by the Nubian Rights Forum and supported by the Kenya Human Rights Commission and a bunch of other civil society groups took the government of Kenya to court because of the Huduma number. And they sued them on the basis of discrimination because the existing ID system, there's some ethnic groups in Kenya that get blanket denials for getting IDs. And to give you context, if you're over the age of 18 and you don't have an ID in Kenya, you can't enter buildings. They're government buildings that you can't enter. You can't get a bank account, you can't get married, you can't die. Like you can't get a death certificate if you don't have an ID card. So they took the government to court on the basis of this discrimination, on the basis of the scope of the data that was being collected, also the basis of a lack of a data protection law, which was resolved because the data protection law was passed, and they won. Qualified partially. So what the court said is they said that the collection of DNA and the collection of GPS data was unconstitutional, but they left the core biometrics and identifying information. They said that was fine because we were already collecting that data anyway. They refused to decide on the discrimination issue. Kenyan courts have a hard time accepting that discrimination happens, which is really frustrating because it happens. And then they said that until the regulations that flow from the Data Protection Act are in place, the government cannot continue to collect data. So they can't continue having this program. So effectively, the law has been suspended, the program has been suspended, and that was impact litigation, that was civil society mobilization, that was a marginalized group that, like I said, literally you don't have permission to die. Mobilizing and getting, there was a lot of support from, organizations, international organizations, because impact litigation is really expensive. But it's a really good example of mobilization on this score, and we're seeing it a lot more in East Africa especially. In the morning we were talking about Tanzania. Tanzania is an interesting case for many reasons, but I think a lot of groups have recognized in Tanzania that what the government is doing is the other extreme, the overcorrection. But that's, literally yesterday that happened.
So who would like to take the other question, or the fintech question?
Because it was a Kenya question.
It was a Kenya question.
Very quickly. I do have a little bit of a history of the fintech in my book, and Safaricom, M-Pesa, and all of that stuff. I think at the very basic, what I would say is we cannot keep building systems that assume that poor people don't deserve good things. I think the problem with the fintech conversation as it has evolved in Kenya is that I, as a middle class person who has access to formal banking services, get better terms, get better services, get better interest rates, than a person who is poor and actually needs it. We have concerns about predatory financing. Even M-Pesa, that everybody celebrates, there are concerns about predatory. The interest rates on M-Pesa go up to 34%. The M-Pesa data collection, the fact that you leave your name at that person's book to get your money in and out, and then the next day you get a call. Women getting calls from people saying, I got your phone number from the book. I just wanted to know if you wanted to be my friend. Like the way in which the fintech conversation has evolved is based on this free-for-all. And the biggest resistance to this data protection has come from, these companies not wanting to be reined in. So for me, the core principle has to be, are we building systems that assume that poor people have the same rights, the same needs as wealthy middle-class people? And I think somehow that principle got lost. And we need to reclaim that back and give people back their dignity. I think access to financial services cannot be a more important principle than basic human dignity.
Yeah, I just want to add a couple of things, because your intervention was really great. In terms of civil society, I am the U.S. chair of the Digital Policy Committee of the Transatlantic Consumer Dialogue. It's a consumer dialogue of 80 consumer organizations from the U.S. and the EU. And our European partners, they were like, they engaged with the European Commission. And when GDPR was was legislated, they were actively involved in the legislation. And there were only the few people. Every time I went to Brussels, I know that these people made real difference. And then on here in the U.S., we have a consumer dialogue, and we push for the U.S. legislation, meaningful and comprehensive legislation here. And we've been doing lots of studies together, both in the U.S. and the EU, and we are trying to bring partners from other parts of the world. For instance, a couple of weeks ago, our Norwegian partners, they published a report about some of the apps, the data collection and data sharing of most of the apps, mostly the dating apps everyone uses. And They published a report. There was an article at New York Times. We sent the letters to FTC, U.S. Congress, and the Attorney Generals. And today, just when I came here, I received a note from my colleagues on the Hill saying that some of the lawmakers, they started an investigation about the dating apps and their data sharing practices. So when we talk about data governance, the civil society has a very, very important role. But unfortunately, there is not enough funding. That's always a problem for civil society. And when there is a funding, it's focused on the different priorities other than checks and balances or legislation. So, and your question about fintech is very interesting because, every time we have a discussion about data and development, there is always someone in the room raising the fintech issue, and then M-Pesa, I was in Kenya last year and I was very curious about the system because that's a story we hear here. We always hear here. And then I asked my Kenyan friends, and what they told me was people borrow so much money, there are lots of people corrupted now, and no one talks about this side of the story, the human side of the story. And that's the problem. When we talk about tech, we always focus about tech for good. But how about the human side of the story? Many people's lives were affected because of these technologies. And my Kenyan friends, my Kenyan colleagues were telling me that it was a good system, but it's not working now and we have no checks and balances.
No one believes me when I say this because I think I'm the only person left in Kenya who doesn't use mobile money. And the reason I don't use mobile money is because I literally sat down and I ran the numbers. If I send you 100 shillings and I pay 10 shillings for every 100 shillings, that's $1, and I pay 10 cents on the dollar for me to send you that money, and I do that 20 times in one day, what am I actually saving? You get billed for sending money, you get billed for receiving money, you get billed for moving money from your M-Pesa account to your bank account, you get billed, when you sit down and add the cost, there are people who are spending up to 10% of their monthly income just on fees and transactions. And then, meanwhile, if you go to a formal bank, you're spending the equivalent of $10 a month, $20 a month, but the banks will not take deposits less than $500 a month. So there's a conversation to be had about expecting poor people and working class people to use substandard things because they should just be grateful that someone has seen them. And yet people's lives are being ruined by the borrowing especially. 34% APR? That's crazy. That's predatory.
All right. Are there more questions? I think we had a few more. There was, and I really don't remember the order. Do you, Kyle? So I don't, I think this gentleman, long time, one here.
And we have some
and one there.
And
we have
web questions, yeah.
Web questions. Okay. So 1, 2, and Bob in the back, and then we'll take the web question after that.
My name is Abdul Fatah. I came from Ghana. I just wanted to, there has been talks on data governance and then whether the responsibility should be given to the government or the private sector. And I just want to find out this, in recent days there has been this emerging issue to do with taxing digital economy. And if you look at it in reality, you see that a lot of countries are losing millions of revenues out of that because they have very little capacity to be able to monitor how much revenues companies are generating to be able to tax it. And my question is, who should the responsibility be given to kind of ensure that big companies pay the taxes that they are supposed to pay on the income that they are generating as a result of the data they generate? I think that's the question. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I would have your question, please, and then after that, Bob. Yeah. Do we have a phone? Okay.
This is a very Zuboffian panel. If you've read our book and got lost in the scale of surveillance capitalism. She uses the phrase at one point, "We are slaves singing in our chains." And at that point I thought, wait, really?
Is everybody familiar with the book?
Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, where we are, as you described it, assets of production. I spent a lot of time in Kenya working in fintech and with data, and there's an awful lot of Kenyans who are using the services productively. There are a lot who are gambling, sports gambling, and they borrow and waste, and there's a huge amount, I forget whether it's 2 million or 4 million were blacklisted through the credit rating agencies because they borrowed and didn't quite understand how to pay back. So there are major consumer protection problems to solve, and there's a competition problem to solve with M-Pesa being effectively monopoly. But people are using this at huge scale, and they're using it not only for personal sending of money to rural areas, they're using it to buy produce in the morning that they can sell in the afternoon. It strikes me that we're casting such a dark shadow over this that we're missing the opportunity, which is there if we can steer it better. It's like the Nubian rights case was very exciting. Similar cases in Jamaica, India. Really good to see these disciplines coming in. But isn't there a high risk that we close down a lot of the opportunity? For example, if we have to have data only kept within a country where it must be processed within the country, when most countries don't have the processing capabilities, or the data needs to be aggregated much more broadly. Are we not kind of getting the tone a little dark here?
Thank you. And then we had Bob Fay in the back. CG.
I think this jumped.
Thank you. So Bob Fay from CG. So we released a publication in November last year called Models for Platform Governance, and Nanjala kindly wrote an essay for us. But one of the things we say in this, can you hear me? Okay, one of the things. Okay. One of the things that we said in this, in one of the essays, is that, more provocatively, that we don't think there is an institution in place right now that can handle the host of issues related to digital governance. And in fact, we need a brand new global institution to do this. I'd just like to get the panel's views on whether that's a pipe dream or whether they would think that's something that's worth pursuing. Regardless, we're going to do it, but I'd still like to hear people's views on it.
These are three wonderful questions. Thank you so much. And some of them were in my notes and I didn't get to them, so I'm very pleased that they came up. There was the question of taxation. Who should have the right and the ability to tax digital companies? Then we have the question of the opportunities versus the downsides. Where do we stand on that? What are the benefits that the digital economy is bringing and that M-Pesa has brought to Kenya, for example, or that other technologies? I mean, India is an interesting country for that as well. And lastly, yes, do we need to entirely rethink where data should be governed at a global level? I think these are all great questions. Who wants to go? Okay.
So I take this question, I think, about being economic opportunities, and then, are we being dark now here? So India's case is, I think, the perfect for this, because in India you have almost, I think now we have 8,000 startups, digital startups, and then almost 60% of the Indians have internet. The issue is the people who have internet, what they are using for, that's the big question. So are they able to get these economic benefits, what we want or aspire to, but that's one issue. The other issue is, are these, the benefits what they are getting, are they fair? So they are fairly priced, our data is not being exploited, or there are rules for these companies how to compete. So these are the other side of it. So in all these, India has problems in each one of these aspects. So you take competition, India has left everything to the corporations. So today you virtually, Amazon rules, and then there is one Indian company which was there that was bought by Walmart. They both are only duopoly, it is actually. So, and if you talk about the privacy, there's no privacy law. Data protection law is just tabled and then passed. Not even a month ago. So, but all this while what India was doing is it was just giving the data to the corporations, and it was collecting, the government also was collecting. So one side government and the other side you have corporations, both were collecting the data and they were using for unintended purposes. So this leaves us, without effective rules. What you are saying is correct when you have effective rules and the capacity to implement and enforce them, and corporations can abide by them, and government also is responsible, to carry out all these things. But the problem is when you have a majoritarian or authoritative government like what we have today, so it's impossible to to carry out the one side, you're balancing of the economic opportunity and the rights of the people. So that's a conundrum we are facing. But the thing is, rights are fundamental. So Supreme Court has given the ruling that in India privacy is a fundamental right, but the government is not really for it. So this leaves us in a very dark situation actually in India. So, and we have now a law, the citizens of so-called Bangladeshi or Pakistani citizens who are coming to India and they have been living in India, they have been rendered illegal. So who knows when they have come and then how government decides this. There is a citizenship law now. So and there is a register for this, and you register every citizen and then see if they are Hindu, Muslim or Christian, and then if you are a Muslim you have to prove it. You have been in India for at least 20-30 years. If you can't prove, then you're out. So where do you go? You go to a detention camp, basically. Yeah. So India is building detention camps. So this is all with technology they're going to do it. Because you have biometric Aadhaar, which is a unique ID. So where you have collected all this data, and then you want to identify who is Muslim, who is not, and then you put them in the detention camp. So now, it's going into the next level now.
So this would be abused by the government. I think the question related to companies, and I think it's the bigger question of, is there a trade-off or isn't there a trade-off? Like, do more rules mean it would diminish the opportunities for growth and access to data and using data in very beneficial ways that lead to growth and social welfare, or can they coexist, and would good governance actually be a competitive benefit in some cases, as we've heard? I think
my point was actually the rules, the rule of law and the institutions. When they are absent, even the government is also as a player in this, and the private players are even more, they can exploit this. That's my point actually. It's if you don't have effective governance mechanism for data, then even private corporations can do the same thing what government is doing. Actually, private corporations are helping government in a way. Yeah. There are private IT companies are building data for government so that government can do all these measures what they have been taking it.
Teresa, and then Burcu. Everyone wants to.
And I'll be fairly brief. There's another area where I think capitalism has a way of. I'm going to talk about it as if it was a person. It has a way of arguing for itself with this idea that stop looking on the dark side. There's so many benefits. There's so many good things. When I was a kid, and that was a long time ago, we understood pollution and waste, and that plastics were a problem, and that we were generating too many emissions, but we were getting so much cool stuff from it, and we would figure it out at some point. And we're now in a climate emergency, and we don't have the answers yet. And people are still idling their cars on in parking spots, and so are we being too dark about data? I think a lot of people have looked at data and the data society and have seen really substantial, significant threats to our democracy, to our society, to our lives, and are raising the alarm about it. And I hope that we're not going to do the same thing all over again and say, oh yes, write a paper, that's a good issue, and we'll fix it. We'll get to it, we'll fix it. But there's so many cool things. Look at this app, it counts my steps. I think it's an urgent situation, and we need to be better about dealing with it than we have about some of the other urgent situations we face.
Building some guardrails. Yeah. Who should build them? Do we need a whole new global institution to deal with data?
Before this question, I just want to address this because at public citizen we say that we represent 99%. So I am a consumer advocate. My role in this discussion is to raise the human side of the issue. The human side of the issue, the consumer side of the issue is we have no rights and protections. And I will make the interventions, because there are many people talking about how good is tech, how the data will bring more development. And they can keep talking on that. But my role as a consumer advocate is to represent consumers and to raise issues relevant to consumers. Because at the end of the day, whatever you do, you are all consumers. You all have these apps on your phone and your data has been shared. Maybe you don't care, but I will care for you, and I will protect your rights. So, coming back to the question related to the Global Data Institution, this discussion has been taking place at the WTO now, the World Trade Organization. They want to be up to date, so they want to come up with rules on digital trade. And about data, when you talk about the trade negotiators, they say that we want to regulate AI or we want to regulate data flows. And the problem is as I mentioned, the starting point is we don't have rules domestically. So when you talk about a global, there were discussions, I think Susan, you raised the issue as well, global data organization or something like that. We have UN, right? We have lots of UN agreements, and those agreements are binding, but not necessarily enforceable. So that's why the tech has been pushing the issue to the trade area and putting all these provisions in trade agreements and the WTO. Although I don't know how long WTO will keep the enforceable system, given that US concerns on dispute resolution. But we need binding rules, but we need those rules to be enforceable. And I don't know how a new organization will be formed. We can introduce binding rules, but how will we make those rules enforceable? Because the trade is a good way to do that. You just threaten countries. This morning I was at the USTR, United States Trade Representative, testifying on behalf of South Africa, because South Africa introduced fair use. This is a very, very American legal concept in South African copyright law to promote access to knowledge and education. And, we should all be proud that, South Africa introduced something very American that everyone admires in intellectual property world. No, the right holders complained about South Africa, and this morning there was a hearing because they want to cut the South African GSP benefits and saying that South African rules do not comply with global international norms. And I was confused because I was this is very American. We have fair use in the US. We are super proud of it. And we want countries to adopt it. And why are we here? Because that's the trade world. A right holder can challenge your flexibility or your safeguard, even though it complies with, the US law. So this is the reality.
I feel we would need a new panel to discuss all of this. First, I think the taxation question, we still need to answer that, and then we still had a question from somebody who was watching this on the web. So therefore, with a view to the clock also, and getting you out of here on time, we'll do these two questions.
With regards to the tax question, this is an issue that we're dealing with, again, South Africa and Kenya, wanting to tax especially US companies. So for example, Netflix. Netflix is the first one that people complained about because it's the first one that we felt like, oh my gosh, Netflix just became more expensive. I think that the language around taxation of these big corporations I think it actually kind of touches to the previous conversations about, well, we're getting all these good things. And I think what you realize is that even if someone is not paying in cash, someone is paying for that freeness that's coming. Amazon just became $1 trillion company and paid $0 in federal taxes in the previous tax year. That means that Americans are not only losing out on all that tax revenue that could go into, let's face it, improving your healthcare system. Come on, guys. And all that money is just not being collected, is going in towards, people are paying for it at a different point. I think what African governments, like I said, the two countries that have had I think Ghana is thinking about this also, taxing foreign digital companies. But the two countries that have actually gone ahead in sub-Saharan Africa that have actually gone ahead to try and do it are South Africa and Kenya.
And Uganda.
But Uganda's was, again, an example of, I would put Uganda and Tanzania. This is let me take a step back. When you talk about we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, we want to do good rules and bad rules, I think what we're seeing right now is a process of correction. I think that the digital space has been a wild, wild west freedom for all frontier because we've conflated the idea of freedom of internet with the freedom of certain companies to make unchecked profits. You can still have a free internet even by having regulations that rein in these oligopolies, these monopolies. You can still have alternatives to, like you can have open source protocols. You can have access to, freely accessible platforms. You don't have to protect the capitalist interests of a handful of monopolies in the name of freedom of the internet. And I think this is the complex conversation that needs to happen in this taxation space. Is it actually punitive to ask a handful of companies that are making a considerable amount of money off the data that we generate or we give to them for free to actually put in regulations in place that say, well, you have to give back to the economies that you're operating in? Is that actually punitive? And secondly, is that a freedom of the internet conversation or is it a separate conversation? And to go back to the M-Pesa, very quickly, plug my book. I talk about M-Pesa in my book quite a bit for this very reason. We are correcting. We've said enough of this wild, wild west open frontier conversation. Let's actually have some kind of, it's not a forest, it's a garden. Let's actually cultivate this garden. Let's actually have things in place that don't leave vulnerable people in a position where their lives could easily be ruined and not have any kind of recourse. And I think that with the fintech conversation, we're not saying let's not have fintech. What we're saying is, can we build with these principles in mind that privilege the protection of poor people, vulnerable people in mind? And so far, that has not been the conversation. If you wanted a deep dive into why M-Pesa takes off in Kenya and Uganda and not in South Africa and not in India, where it was attempted, there's a reasoning behind that. There's conversations about monopolies. There's conversations about unfair business practices. There's conversations there about predatory pricing. And all of these things are just as important to poor and working class people as they are to, I would never accept that from my bank. Why should a person accept that from their mobile company?
All right, and now let's take the web question, and that would be.
Can we grab this one real quick?
Sure.
Yes, thank you. I don't want to be the apologist for technology, but there was a question that the lady in red asked earlier that has never been addressed. Do we need those technologies? And I do think, as an industry, it doesn't make sense that we are 2 steps, 3 steps, 10 years, 15 years behind what are understood to be best practices in what is being done. Yes, data, as all technology, is a tool, but it's also agnostic. It's on the way we use it. All of the example that all of you have given has been misused by people, lack of regulation, weakness in structure. It's not the technology itself. So taking that, we're going to leave the technology behind. We're not going to use it because we're not ready for it, or the people not need it. We can do better with less. It's very often a fallacy. The biometric example, for example, imagine trying to locate people on it, affected people who are itinerant, when they go to access to service and because they cannot be identified.
Excuse me, with a view to the time, because we're almost running out. What is your question?
I just wanted to make the point. I had other questions that have been addressed partially,
Okay.
But that was the point I wanted to make.
Thank you very much for your comment. Really appreciate it. Was there a web question we should take? Then this should be our last question.
Great. So Karen Anderson asked the following question. Has anyone on the panel investigated concepts and mechanisms for enabling individuals to have partial financial ownership of and returns on data related to them?
What? Whoa, that's data property rights. That's a big one for the very end.
Yeah, I think that's another conference by itself.
Do you really want us?
But maybe a fire round.
Can we have
20 seconds?
Teresa, what do you say about data ownership and how it could be structured, and should it even be?
My take on this is that I think that we're starting to see some data protection measures that give individuals considerably more control over their personal data. And I think that that is also leading to the development of new models or new ways of allowing individuals to engage with companies that empower them more. And I think that that's positive, and I think that's interesting. And I do think it's, especially in Europe, stimulating a lot of experimentation and research and around these sorts of things. But the commercialization model for personal data, I have enormous problems with that. And I think that's just a route to more exploitation. So more control, and economic models that put the consumer at the center, maybe. I think there's a lot of potential there, but monetizing personal data, I think, is just a different way of exploiting.
Well, thank you very much for everyone for sticking around for so long with us today. And just wanted to add a thought of my own before I hand it over to Shanta. So in within the program that I'm running at the Heinrich Böll Foundation, the digital policy program, data and development is one element, one program area, and the other way that I like to think about these issues is in the terms of digital rights and sustainability, because we haven't even touched upon that. I think, thank you, Teresa, for bringing up the climate change comparison, because I think it's very important, but it would be the topic for another conference, right? Yeah. But at the end of the day, it is, I like to think of it as people, public, and planet. So how do we, we have to protect all of them. And at the same time, we have to there are many, many great uses for data, and they generate growth, and they facilitate the provision of services, both business and public services. But can we do that, and can we harness these possibilities, these opportunities, without compromising individual rights or democracies or planetary health? Because when we just look at collecting more and more data and more granular data about everything around us, and not just about people, that isn't free. I mean, that costs a lot of energy, data collection, data processing, all these algorithms. So I think in all these cases, we have to ask ourselves, is it worth it? And how far do we have to go? How much is enough? I think these are good questions we could take into many more debates, I guess. So I think this panel has been a little more activist than the others, but I think we probably have consensus on that these are our goals, and that seemed to be the thread of the event. And with that, but I wanted to actually ask Shanta Devarajan to come and talk to us afterwards. And
just clap for your panel.
Oh.